Jedziemy z improwizacją. All right, so yeah, let me begin my presentation. So hi, I'm Adrian, and let me tell you something about me first. So I'm an iOS developer working in Netguru and an organizer of Mobile Warsaw. And today we'll be talking about one of the most underrated features of Xcode, which is the ability to define build settings outside of the PBX project. I don't know how it's pronounced, file. And today I will be talking about three things. First, I would like to begin just shortly about build settings, what they are and what's the problem with defining them in the UI. Then I will talk about xcconfig files, especially about syntax, usage, and some examples. And at the end, I will do a shameless plug and talk about a library of xcconfigs, which basically lets you forget about all the maintenance burden of xcconfig files. So yeah, what are build settings? So Xcode documentation defines them as variables that determine how build tasks are performed. So basically, this is the configuration of how Xcode takes your code and packages it into the app you can install on your phone or upload to the App Store. And there are a lot of build settings. So you might know them from this screen. This is actually like a combined screen, and this is not with the levels. So there are, I think, over 100 different build settings, or maybe over 200 different build settings. And they all do different things. So, for example, here is a build setting for info-list file path, which is how Xcode knows where is the metadata about your app located. And many of the build settings you've never heard of, as well as me. So I don't know, for example, what's the preserve AFH data, HFS data means. And that's why you don't use very often this screen to set build settings, and you rely on the Xcode to set some sensible defaults for you, and you only modify what's needed. So how the build settings are stored, if you ever did some code reviews or ever looked into the diffs in the Git, you might have noticed that Xcode uses a 30-year-old plist format file, which is ASCII plist format. And if you scroll I think 75% of the PBX project file, you will notice that there is a dictionary with all the build settings you defined in your GUI. And what's wrong with them? Why bother thinking about the build settings? So the problem with that is that if you define your build settings in the Xcode visual editor, you don't notice any changes that Xcode does to your settings. So I have experienced sometimes that after migrating from, I don't know, Xcode 8 to 9, Xcode set some build settings which broke my app, which my app wouldn't compile anymore during the migration. So there are some, and I also experienced a situation where the app would build correctly, but because of a mis-set build setting by Xcode, the app would be rejected from the App Store during the app review. So Xcode sometimes doesn't know better, and so by setting the build settings in the UI, you don't notice the difference between the setting you set and between the setting Xcode overrode for you. The second thing is that the PBX proj files are actually very hard to do proper code review on. There are some baby linters for that, but they don't do a very good job with very complex files, and some of your apps have many targets, and the linters they don't handle these very large files very well. So, and you must rely on manual code review at the end. So even the linters don't know the correct values for build settings, and in big teams where the build settings matter, you rely on the code review. And it's very hard to, even if you notice the change in the PPA PBX proj file, which is like surrounded by a ton of boilerplate with no context. You need to expand, like, even to get to know what build configuration the setting was set for. Then it's a problem. So one of the things that xcconfig files also provides is import, inheritance, composition, and conditions, which can be summarized as amazing features and like more powerful than they are available in the visual editor. So yeah, let me do a swan dive and introduce you to the xcconfig files. So I defined them like the Xcode letting you to define them in the plain text files outside of the PBX proj file, and they have a very, very simple syntax. So let me begin with that. So first thing you can do in the xcconfig files is to include other xcconfig files. You can do it like you did it in the Objective-C or in C by #include. You can do basic assignments. So for example, here I'm assigning a value of imaginary build setting greeting to hello. You can also, like in the visual editor, do value interpolation. So you can use the values of other build settings to compose a new value out of them. So in this example, I'm defining a new build setting called phrase, which will have the value of hello Mobile Warsaw. Another thing with another special value, it's actually like a special variable called Iterated. Allows you to inherit build settings from a hierarchy. So you can set build settings on the project, then on the build configuration, then in the target, and then in the target build configuration. And they all have this, like, there is a hierarchy, and the lower values can inherit from the upper ones. So this is actually useful, for example, if you define build settings for like search paths where the Xcode should look for header files or framework binaries. You can rely on the default values for them and add your own append, like at the beginning, like here, or at the end, and use the default value as well. And other like very not used very much, but very sometimes needed syntax is conditional assignment, and which allows you to specify different values for one build setting depending on some condition, for example, on the operating system, which the app is being compiled for. So for if you have a framework and you define a build setting called truth, when you're compiling for Mac, it will say AppKit rules, and if you're compiling for iOS, it will say AppKit sucks. Yeah, both are true at the same time. So this is the example of like a very simple xcconfig file. First, I import some imaginary general xcconfig which contains some like default build settings, and then I use the values for that I obtained from the either documentation or the Xcode visual editor, which I will show you, to set my build settings here instead of the visual editor. Yeah. So what are the advantages of the xcconfig files? So xcconfig files, like as I mentioned before, allow you to do easier code review because there is no clutter and boilerplate, and you can be sure that all changes to these files are intentional and made by the developer, not by the Xcode itself. It allows you to have better structure and composition because you can organize the build settings, you can group them in like logical chunks, you can decompose them into separate files, and you can basically do with them what you want and not rely on the enforced way Xcode defines them in the UI. You can reuse build settings between different files, projects, targets, maybe like between teams. If you, for example, work in a company which have some basic flags for the compilers for all their projects, there can be one central xcconfig file you can import in every project, and you can be sure that it doesn't interfere with the Xcode default settings. Another thing that is often forgotten with the build settings is that people sometimes don't know why a build setting is set to a value it's set to, and with the xcconfig files has a syntax for comments with // and you can actually like document why a build setting is set for a value within that comment, and you can't do that in the visual editor at all. And basically, why most features are available in the visual editor, it's much simpler to use them here in xcconfigs, because expanding like the little triangles in the in the visual editor is very hard, and it's hard even to find how, for example, a conditional assignment is performed in the visual editor. So yeah, these were some advantages. And now I would like to tell you about some disadvantages. So there are multiple sources of truth if you use xcconfigs and also use visual editor. So that means that a build setting can be defined in PPA PBX proj file and in the xcconfig file. And while it is a standard that xcconfig files always take precedence over the value set in the visual editor, except for the last layer, which is the target. It actually sounds complicated because it is. So if you use build settings in xcconfigs, you would want either to all of them be in the xcconfigs or all of them be in the visual editor, because otherwise it will be hard for you to find where the value is coming from. And also, if you go with the first solution, which is define all build settings in the separate files, you need to keep in mind that you will need to maintain the values, the default values the Xcode sets. You will either be unsetting them or setting a new defaults, and you need to keep track what are the new build settings coming in every version of Xcode or even the compilers, and what are the recommended values for all the build settings. And you need to keep track of that and do like manual migrations basically for your files. So there is a kind of solution for those disadvantages, and that's libraries. So as you can import xcconfig files, you can create libraries of xcconfig files to be used in separate projects. So in Netguru, I created a library of xcconfigs called xcconfigs. And it basically, I have a couple of GIFs to show you, and then I will showcase how it actually works. So basically you start by going to your target, selecting all build settings in the both in the project and in the target, and just completely deleting all of them. Then you create some files. I don't have a GIF for that. And you then set those files in the info tab of the project settings file in the Xcode. So this drop-down means that I have like application.xcconfig, tests.xcconfig, and all other files, and I set them to the specific build configuration and a target, and then the Xcode knows like which file is supposed to be used where. And at the end you build and everything works, hopefully. Yeah, so the Netguru xcconfigs library is divided. It has like three ways it's structured. It's per configuration, per platform, and per target type. So there are some default build settings in there maintained by us for both default and release configurations. If you have more of them, for example, we sometimes use staging configuration like production, release, app store, development. You can derive all of them from these two. So basically the debug is making it easier for you to debug. It doesn't do any optimizations, and release prepares your app to be distributed in the App Store and in an enterprise way. Just don't distribute spam like Facebook did. The other way the xcconfig library is structured is per platform. So there are separate xcconfig files for each platform, like macOS, iOS, tvOS, and watchOS, maybe CarOS in the future or something. And they contain basic default build settings that Xcode sets and for all those platforms, and you can import those files in your files as well. And then the last criteria is per target type, and we have files for application, extension, framework, and test bundle targets. So everything except like aggregate targets, and yeah, I think that's it. So yeah, let me do a short showcase now on a real project that I've been working on like a couple of months ago. Okay, so here I have a project file, a project for an app for my university that I've been working on, which is using the Netguru xcconfigs library that I've been talking about. And the first thing you might notice here that it doesn't actually use real build settings as the assignment values, and we went the other way and let you define the values for like variables or like pseudo build settings, and the real build settings are then derived from all of them. So that way we don't we are not hostage to the very 30-year-old history of different build settings and or the backwards compatible values you have to use, and we can actually do some work behind the scenes to define the deployment target for iOS in the real build setting based on, for example, a value of this. Let's call them variables. So I have nine xcconfig files in this project, and let me show you how they work, starting with the project file. So the xcconfigs library suggests you define a different file per each entry here. So, for example, I have a common development xcconfig for development build configuration, and then every xcconfig files for every target separately. So for app development, for tests development, and then staging, app staging and test staging. So they basically inherit from each other, and for example, in a common base, I only define some versions called development team, and some deployment targets which are universal for the whole project. Then in the development build configuration, I only specify it's called the environment, which is then translated to the preprocessor macro, and a Swift debug flag you can use with like #if and development and do conditional compilation there. By default, it's debug and release, and since I'm using development and staging, I had to rename them. The app base is overwriting some default values for bundle name, where's the asset icon located, and whether to enable bitcode. These are the real build settings, not the variables, and you can distinguish the variables because they prefix with an underscore. And you might have noticed that all these files import the specific files from the library. The external path is containing the library of xcconfigs. So, for example, in app base, I'm importing the application and then iOS because it's the target for it's an app target for iOS. In tests, I import tests and iOS because of the same reason. And let me just quickly count the lines. like 30. Here are 3. I think it's like over maybe less than 50 lines in total in all these build settings, and yet there is, if you look at the project file here, there is nothing. Let me expand it. There is nothing set in the even in targets and on the project level. So the second and the fourth column, and this means that if I change something, change a build setting in the xcconfig file, it will not affect the PBX proj file, and the people who will do code review for me will be happier and actually may catch mistakes and not skip the PBX proj file entirely. Because let's be honest, how many of you have skipped the PBX proj file entirely when doing code review? Yeah. And yeah, I skipped once as well, and we had an App Store rejection, so I don't recommend doing that. Yeah, so that was like a little showcase. I didn't want to do like a whole demo of setting up actually project, because it would take like 30 hours maybe to to start from the scratch and fight with an Xcode. There is the repository itself contains an extensive documentation and a tutorial of how to set up the project with using just the xcconfigs, and how it integrates with CocoaPods and CardHedge as well, because CocoaPods are actually they actually define their own xcconfig files that you need to include in your xcconfig files. Yeah, so let me go back to my slides. Okay. Yeah, I skipped a slide here. I forgot to add it here, which would say, are you supposed to use xcconfig files, and when are you supposed to use them? So if you're working alone, if you know like your build configurations and you know that Xcode didn't change anything from you, you could keep track of the diffs, then you don't need to use xcconfig files. These are supposed to help you, not to like introduce a burden and a mess. So I suggest using xcconfig files in larger teams and take advantage of the libraries like Netguru xcconfigs or the Justin-Summers /xcconfigs, which actually was my inspiration and which is used by which was used by GitHub internally when developing reactive Cocoa and Mantle and the other frameworks that Justin had worked on. And if you want to learn more about build settings, you can go to the unofficial guide of xcconfig files, which is the best place. I will put the slides on my GitHub and you can click the links. This is the best place to learn everything about build setting syntax and different features it has, because Apple doesn't provide any documentation of that. Like, it has documentation of the actual build setting names and values, but not on the syntax of xcconfig files. And I mentioned the Justin-Summers repository, which is still maintained and is an alternative to Netguru xcconfigs if you want to use them. So yeah, thank you for listening, and now if you have any questions, I will happily answer them.
You mentioned two drawbacks of using xcconfig files, and I kind of have a feeling that you had to make them up because they are not real drawbacks. They're just a fact that some people in your team might not adjust to your style of coding. So have you found any real, like, hard fact drawbacks of using xcconfigs?
So like, I consider maintenance burden a real disadvantage because you actually can't rely on Xcode setting the values for you. You need to set them manually. But yeah, okay, but you can keep a stable environment for the sake of this concrete project. Yeah. So if you're telling like xcconfig files is an official way to define build settings, and is a perfectly fine alternative. And there are no behavioral disadvantages of using xcconfig files, except that it might be like it might have a steeper learning curve to like find the build settings. Yeah. I hope that answered that question.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Are there any other questions? And if
Do you have any experience on migration between Xcode and Swift versions using xcconfigs?
yes. What do you want to know about that?
And how did
Yeah, so as a maintainer of xcconfigs, I needed to actually release another version of xcconfig library containing a new default values. So what I did personally, I defined a dummy project in Xcode. In Xcode, it was 8, then opened it in Xcode 9, asked Xcode to perform migration, and then diffed what the Xcode did change. And I set those values accordingly as the default values in the library. And then all of the other projects in Netguru that were using the library, they automatically got the same migration of build settings as they pulled the library using cartridge. You can pull it using cartridge, yeah. So, if you think of any other questions in 5 minutes, please freely come to me and ask me. I will happily answer them after the presentation. So, if there aren't any more, there aren't. Thank you.